Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And I have with me a guest from Massachusetts, a tenured sociology professor at Boston College, Charles Derber, who I was introduced to through a mutual friend. And we had dinner together, and I was fascinated to learn more about him. Man, Charlie, you've done 28 books. I'm in awe. I've done 4, but good for you. I'll just read a few of the titles: Wilding of America, The Pursuit of Attention, Sociopathic Society, Corporate Nation, People Before Profit, Dying for Capitalism, Greed to Green, Welcome to the Revolution. But we want to talk about this volume, Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. And this is a scholarly publisher, Routledge. I've done a few chapters in textbooks with Routledge. The cartoon, by the way, says almost extinct, and then endangered species in the U.S., including a democracy image. You did this book with another sociology professor of UMass Dartmouth, I believe, Yale R. McGrath, who you've also co-authored a number of volumes with. This book has been translated into 14 languages. And you are a public sociologist, longtime activist, and you write about structural and cultural analysis of capitalism, public goods, the environment, social movements, seeking transformational change. And you are a lifelong activist for peace and social justice. You're my kind of guy. All I can say is I want to share with my listeners, and this was a conversational thing between you and Dr. McGrath, where you don't agree on everything, but it's meant to make people think for themselves.
And we wanted to model democracy, Stephen. So where we didn't want to, we wanted people to see democracy in practice, which means that you allow disagreement and that we didn't. So I think, and it is an unusual format for a book as a conversation, but I think it's working well because it's, you can tell me, but I think it's easy to read a conversation. It makes it quite accessible to most ordinary readers. It's not an academic book.
Indeed. So let's start with the clickbaity stuff. Deep state.
Yes.
So you have a different take on deep state. Could you tell us about?
Right. So the idea of a deep state, of course, Trump has made it very popular, and we think he's got a small part of it correct. The idea of a deep state suggests that there's a state behind the state, or in other words, a kind of ruling power, some sort of group that has the ability to actually exercise disproportionate control over the government itself and the country. Trump focuses particularly on the one hand, a sector that we also agree is part of this kind of hidden power, which is the national security establishment, namely the CIA, the FBI, and the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. And we think this is an important part of a deep state. And we, by the way, I don't know if you know this, Stephen, but the majority of Americans have been polled long before Trump and even now, and they do believe that the government is, influenced and or controlled by unelected people with a lot of power. So this is not a particularly radical view. Even though we call ourselves a democracy, many people understand that the power of big money and the power of race and other kinds of factors play a big role in whose voice is actually heard. So our view of the deep state is that there is a kind of hidden community. We don't mean this in a conspiratorial way exactly.
Well, that's the key, is like, this is, it's kind of, a propaganda term, deep
Right. It's
state, the way
easily,
Trump
it lends
uses it.
itself easily. And I think Trump does this, to a wild conspiracy idea. And we don't argue that, well, let me just tell you who we think the deep state is, and then we'll explain why I don't think this is a wild conspiracy theory. And, so the deep state, in our view, is a triangle of power, which it sort of derives from the work of the most famous sociologist of the 20th century, a guy named C. Wright Mills, who taught at Columbia, wrote a book called The Sociological Imagination and the Power Elite, which was among the most important books of the 20th century. And he argued that the power elite was made up of the three groups that we talk about as part of the deep state. One is something I think that is intuitively plausible to most people, that very wealthy people and large corporations exercise enormous power over the country. And it's kind of obvious. I mean, about 90% of Americans understand that big banks and private equity firms and large companies play a very large role. And so that's one very critical part of the deep state, maybe the most important. And that's why we call it often the corporate deep state. And then there are two other closely related sort of communities. One is the military industrial complex, which sort of encompasses part of the national security establishment that Trump is talking about, and involves the military essentially, and the people that are managing them, primarily non-elected people who manage the foreign affairs of the country. And the third group is the upper levels of the civilian bureaucracy. So that would be people around the president, again, unelected people, but who exercise disproportionate control over the country. So when you think about those three groups, first of all, it's different from Trump's idea, because Trump says, well, there is a deep state, but it's where we agree is the national security establishment. It has a great deal of disproportionate power, and it is unelected. But he also largely focuses on the civilian regulatory and public welfare bureaucracies of the government. Project 2025, which you might have talked about in your conversations up to this point, is all about essentially destroying the non-political civilian bureaucracy and turning them into what's called Schedule F personnel, who are going to be politically appointed by the top 50,000 people in the civilian government. This is the core of Trump's deep state, and he regards them as liberal civil servants who are basically channeling the government to serve poor people and tax the hardworking white Americans that he regards as the real people in the country, the real citizens of the country.
So if I may, Dr. Derber, just say that I've interviewed a UK journalist who just has a book coming out on Opus Dei. And literally, I interviewed him for the Influence Continuum, and he talked about how the president of the Heritage Foundation is Opus Dei. He's the one who's the architect of Project 2025. That's right,
Kevin Roberts,
Kevin Roberts. And so he names a lot of very high-ranking people, including William Barr, former Attorney General, many top people. So I just want to add another wrinkle to your thesis about, cultic authoritarian organizations that have a maybe religious or political agenda to destroy the rule of law, to set themselves up in a theocracy. This, for me, is part of the deep state, in the sense that these people have been working for decades to this end. A group called the Council for National Policy, that Ann Nelson wrote a book called Shadow Network. They too have been working for 50 years with the Koch Corporation, second largest private corporation. So there are these other known authoritarian cult entities that I would add are part of this infrastructure that's influencing a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it's interesting, just the whole idea of your podcast as the influence continuum. I mean, in a way, what we're saying is there's a political influence continuum in the whole country, which is exercising a lot of influence over the country. And sometimes that melds, as you suggest, with cult-like communities. I mean, in a way, Trump, and you're the master writer on this, is sort of directing the cult-like parts of what we would call the deep state in the name of attacking their deep state. And so there's some very interesting overlaps in the kinds of stuff that you write about so well, and the kinds of, sort of unelected influence communities who have disproportionate control over the elected government and, radically weaken the actual voice of ordinary people.
Yes.
One thing I just want to add to this,
please,
Stephen, that, this book is a history of the crises of democracy in the United States. So it goes all the way back. And the reason for this is that the kind of problem that we're talking about is not novel or new. It goes right back to the really beginning of the country. And so people often think that Trump is a completely new force in America as he's mobilizing these kind of cultic communities that are around him. What we show is that this really began, actually, I think we have a very novel argument about the revolution in the United States in 1776. And what we argue is that the country was founded as a very uneasy marriage between two deep states. The northern mercantile deep state, which was the beginning of capitalism. These are people who were mainly merchants, and they wanted more independence from the British and so forth. And the southern deep state, which was a slave state, and it was based largely on caste. Caste is simply arguing that certain people, because of their race or their biological condition, can never really move beyond. Once you're born into a caste, you stay in a caste. A class, the northern capitalist mercantile community, I say that the marriage between them, which formed the United States, the North and the South came together, was very uneasy because the North represented class. In the end, the ideology of class is that whatever class you're born into, theoretically, you can move up by hard work and so forth to a higher class. But if you're based on caste, your biology says no matter what you do, you're always going to be in the same caste. So there was always tension in the United States between the northern values and ideology, which was a kind of capitalist, financially based corporate deep state, and the South, which was a caste-based deep state, which was mostly white. If you were white and male, you get to, have a voice in the country. But if you were non-white, if you were female, if you were a slave, even if you were a poor white man, you couldn't really have a vote. And what we argue as we unfold the history of the country is that, like many uneasy marriages at the beginning, the tensions between them grew over time, so that by the Civil War, it actually ended, like many such troubled marriages do, in divorce. And so we sort of talk about how this marriage came into being, this reconciliation of two quite different deep states, a sort of capitalist deep state and a caste kind of neo-fascist deep state, and how they came apart, and then how they came back together again later with the rise in the early 20th century, when the Gilded Age robber barons, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Carnegies, built the federal government as the ruling deep state, which was capitalist basically in character, but the sort of caste-based sort of influences never went away. We talk about fascist ghosts. And when you think about the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, they literally looked like ghosts. They were put on white sheets. And what we mean by that is that the Southern caste-based sources of power and ideology never went away. It was kind of a proto-fascist ideology. And I'm sure you know this, Stephen. I think we talked about it, that Hitler was very interested in Southern ideology and the sort of caste-based racial theories that developed in what we call the proto-fascist. We call this American fascism. It began even before European fascism. Mm-hmm. And it greatly influenced people like Hitler, who dispensed his German scientists to come to the South and study American eugenics and to study how racial theory, the codes after Reconstruction, when Jim Crow resurfaced after the North basically retreated from the South. And so the federal state remained a capitalist corporate deep state. But in the South and increasing parts of the West and much of the rural areas of the country, what we call fascist ghosts, the remnant of the Southern deep state, maintained power in many, local and state level governments and so forth. So There's a long history, and this proto-fascist caste-based deep state sort of points to the ways in which Trump, it goes way back in American history, the kind of neo-fascist kinds of power that he representing. In a way, he was born into the capitalist class, but he's running on a politics of caste to a large degree, arguing that immigrants and non-white people are basically poisoning the blood of the country, which is, of course, the language that Hitler himself used. And so he's going back in a way to that very early founding of the country, which created an uneasy tension between the kind of capitalist corporate deep state and the biologically based blood and soil deep state that the South represented.
Right.
And we're seeing this play out again in this very important election that's coming up. But I think if you look at our book and who owns democracy, it's always been the owners of democracy in America have always been people with a lot of money and the big corporations, and also people with the right skin color and, the right biological format that Trump is now trumpeting as part of the real people of America, as he says, I'm going to deport 20 million Americans and who are immigrants and just sweep in a lot of people who are not white. That goes right back to the beginning of the country. I mean, even we write about Jefferson, some of the theorists of democracy early on in America. Jefferson never believed that black people, even though he developed a relationship with a black slave, Sally Hemings, and had children with her, he never believed that slaves and black people could be part of a functioning civil democracy. There's a lot of writing. He was a very articulate intellectual guy, but he just never really he never believed that this caste barrier could be overcome. And just one other thing, this historically, for anybody who might be listening who's interested in history, the people who ran America prior to the Revolution had funny names like Washington, Jefferson, Adams, so forth. The people who ran the country after the Revolution, they also had funny names like Jefferson, Adams, Washington. In other words, it wasn't as much a revolution as people expect. It brought independence from the British Crown and Parliament, but it didn't change the actual people who were, dominating and in the most influential inside the United States. And It's worth noting that Jefferson and the other founders sort of made the revolution in the spirit of the Magna Carta. Do you remember the Magna Carta, Stephen? It was the 1215 British medieval doctrine where the British nobility, who were not monarchs, rose up against the king because they wanted to share more of the property and more of the rights of control with the monarch. Now, this was seen as sort of a foreshadowing of democracy, but it really was not a democratic idea. It was that the king should share power with other rich white men. But it didn't really, the Magna Carta was not truly a democratic. It wasn't arguing that most people in Britain should have power. It was arguing it should not be concentrated simply in one man. It should be distributed among a community of rich white men. And so I think, if you look at pictures historically of the Continental Congress and when the Constitution was being written, it has the words and images of the Magna Carta right on it. And we know from historical study that the founders of the United States were very guided in their view of democracy by the Magna Carta. They saw themselves as sort of implementing a Magna Carta in the United States. And that tells you right away how problematic the idea of democracy was in the United States, because the Magna Carta says we shouldn't have a sole authoritarian king, but it says that we should have a small group of very wealthy white men who should run the country. And that's not a very viable democratic ideal.
Right. So if I can just say for my listeners, a couple of things. One is I'm so grateful to be still living in a country where you and I can speak this way publicly, because people in China would be in jail or killed, or Russia, or any number of other dictatorships. So that's first and foremost.
And I want to ask you, Stephen, whether you think we could have this conversation after the election after November 5th, or after, when the next president comes in. If it's Trump, are we going to be able to have this conversation in this country?
I don't know, but it's one reason I wanted to have it and record it and put it online and save it. But what I want to say, Charles, is that we have the benefit of time and perspective to see the changes, and the intellect and desire to look for facts and look for the historical record for things. And, I grew up with the American exceptionalism that, Columbus Day, education about what was done to indigenous people, how we lied to them and gave them blankets with smallpox, or wiped them out, or killed their food sources intentionally, put them in religious schools. In other words, and then when I was researching the cult of Trump, I read a book called The Republic of Lies, which was all about the history of conspiracy theories from the beginning, and how conspiracy theories were actually even part of the American Revolution. So what I'm trying to just say, and to continue this conversation, is that I'm an optimist and realist at the same time. I want to imagine a better world where we can all live together with peace, under rule of law, with a real separation of powers, to have checks and balances, where there isn't unbridled capitalism and greed and ideology like Ayn Randism and objectivism and all of that other crap. So what I don't want is for people to just hear us talking going, oh, we're anti-American, because we're pro-freedom and democracy, and we have a better vision of what we should be moving towards.
Yes. And this book is a hopeful book that the history that we recount and our vision of what can happen shows that despite this long concentration of power with money, with large amounts of money, for very wealthy people and corporations, and the long history, sad history of, race and gender bias and so forth. There's always been strong popular movements going right back to the beginning of the country, which have really tried to, took the ideals of democracy that Jefferson was writing about, that sounded very genuine and authentic, and took it and made it the creed of the country. And so the history of this book says, there have been a lot of structural, institutional, hardwired problems in terms of ordinary people being able to have their voice heard. But there's also been a never-ending set of struggles by working people, civil rights movements, suffragists and feminists. And we recount those in some detail in each stage of American history. And it sort of speaks to the current, it makes you hopeful that, I want to be sober. I think if Trump wins, the forces we're up against are going to be very, very formidable and frightening. But, right now we're in probably the closest election that we're ever going to be in. I can't imagine it closer. And
an important one, I would add.
Really, really important, because, like I say, Trump is reuniting this very powerful mix of big money, with sort of cultural and racially oriented kind of division of the population. And it's a toxic brew. And the history that we shows one, it's been very powerful all the way through American history. It's got some new wrinkles today, but with all of American history. But American history has continued to expand democracy despite all this, from its very limited, almost non-existence. When the country was founded, nobody voted. People didn't vote for, voting, even among white men, didn't really begin until about the 1830s. And,
I didn't know that.
So there's a long history of expansion, and that's come from struggle, from ordinary people who learned, just like what you and I did, that America was this exceptionalist democracy and had to re-educate themselves. And, the politics is partly education and sort of learning our history. It's like learning about ourselves. You can't know me, Stephen, until you know my whole history and how I came to think and, as I do. And I think that's true collectively for the country. That's why we thought it was important to have a conversation about the history of the United States and look at how these crises of democracy, which are being treated now largely as relatively new and different from our whole history as an aberration, to show that, one, it's been such a deep factor throughout the story of our country. It's the storyline of our country, but it's not just a negative storyline. It's ordinary people and social movements, from suffragettes, abolitionists, labor groups. When the Rockefeller and Morgan and these very, very rich initial Gilded Age capitalists came into being, a very strong populist movement came into being, which was seeking to bring the Wall Street, the first Wall Street, basically Morgan's empire, into under control. And so in each stage of history, these powers of class and caste rise up, but then ordinary people who feel something is wrong, they may not have the vocabulary for it, but they have a way of understanding that these were agrarian people in the populist era in the 1890s. And they had a very powerful educational movement and political movement and almost took over the Democratic. They formed a party called the People's Party. And it was, all through history, Americans have had success in understanding these issues and organizing against them. So it's not a hopeless story at all.
No, and I would add there are some wealthy people who realize that money isn't the goal.
Right.
It's not really going to bring true happiness or fulfillment, and are using their wealth to help other people to revivify institutions that are trying to support women's rights, for example, to have control over their own bodies, for civil, laws, for checks and balances. I was watching a 60 Minutes episode about an appointee of the Biden administration who's trying to bring lawsuits against the big corporate, technocrats and hold them accountable and just label them as monopolies that they are.
Right. Yeah. Silicon Valley is such a big part of the corporate state that we're focusing on now. And it's become right in the center of the election here as Elon Musk and, some of his buddies in Silicon Valley are playing such a big Peter Thiel. I write about him a lot. These people are very influential and, Musk is basically paying for Trump's ground game and so forth. The knock on the door that you might get in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin is coming from somebody hired by Elon Musk or Peter Thiel to do this work. But let me just also make to show you that I'm not partisan fully in this. We have a very strong critique of the Democratic Party in here as well. And in my view, you can see it as well in the current election, even though I'm all for Kamala Harris winning this election, because I think Trump's melding of the two deep states is so proto-fascist. It overrides everything.
Yes.
But the Democratic Party, certainly since Reagan, since the end of the New Deal, has embraced too much of both the corporate world and the national security establishment that to make me comfortable. I mean, one sees this particularly in regard to war. If you say the deep state is the triangle of the corporate world, the military, and the top civilian levels of government, the Democrats have been Biden and now Harris to some degree. They're fighting both in Ukraine and supporting the Israelis in the Middle East in ways that are, in my view, not sufficiently critical of there's too much of what happened in America till 9/11, America's imperial policies in the Middle East and around the world during the Cold War. We're seeing, Biden had really embraced this kind of U.S. imperial policy for most of his political career, and it's what the Democratic Party has largely done for many, many years. So in some way, we're locked into parts of the deep state that is the national security and sort of military expansionist part of the government, because both parties are so deeply engaged with that. And the corporate world, Biden has been surprisingly liberal in identifying with labor and helping working people get more health care and more education and more secure jobs and so forth. But there's still a lot of corporate influence in the Democratic Party. Sure. And it's kind of interesting. When Roosevelt was elected in 1944 for his fourth term, this was when the Depression was still going on, there was a kind of socialist, very progressive guy named Henry Wallace, who was his vice president. And had he been, Eleanor Roosevelt had wanted him, everybody knew that Roosevelt was going to die right after the 1944 election. He would probably be elected and he would probably die. So his vice president would become president. And his vice president at the time was Henry Wallace, a quite progressive, anti-war socialist. The corporate parts of the Democratic Party prevailed on Roosevelt to throw Wallace out and to pick a guy you've heard of named Harry Truman to step in. And Truman was much more, the corporate Democratic world was much more comfortable with Truman, knowing that he would, sustain corporate power and American imperial influence. And the reason I mention him is that, people thought at the end of World War II, it was such a devastating war. We might have a peace dividend and a world built on peace. And Wallace probably would have been able to avoid the worst parts of the Cold War after Roosevelt's death. But we didn't have Wallace. We had Truman, and Truman invested, and we show this deeply in the book, in a war state after World War II when everybody thought there could be, there were many parts of the military that thought we should not be fighting Hitler. We should be fighting the Russians. And a lot of people, some of the top military brass, who went into Berlin, they didn't want to stop. They wanted to go right from Berlin to Moscow, even though, of course, Russia had been our ally, and the Russians had paid the most for the number of 400,000 Americans died in World War II, 40 million. More like 25, 30 million Russians died in World War II. And Russia really, along with Britain, won the wars. But America charged into a global expansion policy because of the corporate influence on our government. And we could have avoided that. And it took a peace movement during Vietnam to see some of that, or, the sort of challenge to American, militarism come out. But, I grew up in the 1960s and 70s, and my life was shaped, as probably yours was to some degree, Stephen, by the intensity of the peace movement and the anti-war movement during Vietnam. And it's now coming back. We don't know how it's going to shape the current election, because there are people who are really unhappy with the war going on in the Middle East and would like to see more territorial compromise in even in Ukraine. It's not, so that's a longer story, but I'm just saying the militarism is a big part of the problem, and that what we're facing here, the worst and most dangerous, is the influence of Trump, as if he should win for. But the Democrat, there's going to need to challenge the Democrats as well. God hope that she can win, but then we're going to have to challenge her to move, in my judgment, away toward more regulation and control of the corporation and more curbing of the militarism that's dominated both parties for so long.
So I'm going to ask the pushback question about China, authoritarianism, Putin and authoritarianism,
Right.
Muslim extremist states that believe America needs to be wiped out,
Right.
and that's playing identity politics, and the point of view that says if we don't have a strong military, they will eat us alive, and we therefore need to have some type of strength. That said, I just came from a conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., where several experts were talking about nuclear destruction and how the nuclear arsenals are now being discussed as viable options to use in first strike thing, and how insane that is. And again, I too am a peacenik, and I want planetary survival and not planetary extinction. But I worry about criticizing America without criticizing people who are working actively to put Trump into power, the Chinese and the Russians in particular, to dismantle the United States. So, love to hear your thoughts.
I think a few things. Again, the history is very helpful, Stephen, when you're thinking about the role of America in the world. After World War I, the U.S. entered World War I because J.P. Morgan had loaned his fortune to the British, and if the British had lost in World War I, it would have destroyed Wall Street, and the U.S. Economic system probably would have collapsed. So Morgan convinced his friend Teddy Roosevelt to get, and then later Woodrow Wilson, to get into the war. And after the war, the U.S. withdrew and continued to let the European colonial powers, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, to control much of the world. Now, I mention this, what might appear an old, dusty history, to sort of give us a little bit of perspective on the world today. You might have noticed that much of the world, Africa, Latin America, much of the Middle East, is not rallying behind the United States, opposed to these more authoritarian countries that you're mentioning correctly, like Russia and Iran and so forth, because their experience with the United States was not this benevolent democracy it's sort of part of our story of democracy in America, right? America has run a very hegemonic, the word hegemony, it means global control or domination. And the U.S., by all conservatives and liberals, all understand that since World War II, the U.S. has been like an empire. It's been the dominant hegemonic control power in the world. And whether it was invading, where does our problems in Nicaragua and El Salvador and other people coming over the border now and the immigration, these countries were destroyed by American military interventions in Central America and Latin America, creating, breeding the conditions that have led so many people to try to flee these countries today because they've been broken by decades of American military interventionism and support of dictators in these countries. These very authoritarian powers that you're talking about have been supported by the United States through much of the world, basically in service of money. It doesn't help the American worker, but it helps big corporations that want to be in poor countries, that don't regulate them, tax them, don't allow unions, and so forth. So that's just a history to keep in mind. In terms of how do you deal with the power of, I would separate a little bit Russia from China, and note that Russia is really just a big oil company with a military, but it has nuclear weapons. And you're absolutely right that the scariest thing about the Ukrainian war right now is that it could go Putin is threatening to go nuclear, and the United States is providing Zelensky with offensive weapons now, which, if used, if some of our heavy duty bombs and drones were to hit Moscow, I think this could escalate into a nuclear conflict. So we have an enormous interest in seeing survival. We're not going to survive a big nuclear war. And so this war, like many of these wars, the Middle East could is right on the verge of blazing into an all-out regional war, which could draw in the Chinese, who depend on, Iranian oil and so forth. So, that's why the UN, after two devastating world wars, the UN was created to try to create some kind of international body to, bring peace to these kinds of conflicts. The US has never permitted the UN to function in this way. And so let's just say there are ways of dealing with authoritarian and aggressive countries if we were to build up the kind of international order that America had actually envisaged when Roosevelt and the Eleanor Roosevelt was talking about the UN as the builder of universal human rights, so that all countries would not be able to sort of integrate themselves into the global community if they weren't giving people in their own countries, including these autocratic countries that you're talking about, and then maybe including our country if Trump gets back in and these rights are, like reproductive rights, are being pulled away from people. So, I think the solution to, given all world history, to autocratic threats is not to build up your own autocratic threat or your own military that's willing, because basically we look at the history of empire and of civilization, and we see, in the name of conquering, despotic countries, for century after century, the country responding becomes its own autocracy and becomes its own domineer, as America did during so much of the Cold War. And so I think these threats need to be taken seriously, but we need to find routes to them, as in this country. Trump says what he's done is succeeded in blaming immigrants and people of color and poor people for the problems of the country generally. And his solution is to deport, 20 million immigrants is not going to solve the economic problems or the social problems in this country. I have the same view broadly of using, hard militarism as a way to solve the problem of, the Americans even agreed that after 9/11, they went into Iraq and Afghanistan and created wars that were complete failures and did nothing to bring democracy. They just brought more chaos and autocracy in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. So I agree that we want to be engaged internationally, but the way to do so is not to make everybody have a big stick, a nuclear stick that's so powerful that people are going to just bow down to it, but rather to do the hard work of building the alliances and building the international institutions that allow this to function. It's interesting, on the economic front, we have a global governance. It's called the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. This provides certain kinds of universal standards. They're pretty corporate because they don't let labor unions and working people into these bodies. But, the World Trade Organization sits in Washington right next to the American Treasury Department. And so these are American controlled, but they offer certain kinds of international standards. And that's what we need in the military as well, not building up America to crush other countries, as we've done through, much of the 20th century in the Cold War, but to build up the kinds of international peacekeeping institutions that can, and the alliances, including, peaceful alliances, with Europe and with, China is, just to point to China, while it's building up its military in the Pacific theater, is not a global military. Even in the long ancient eras of Chinese empire in the world, it never really went beyond the kind of geographic Pacific theater of that. China has never had a military capacity or aspiration to rule the world in the way that, say, the European colonial power did or the United States did in the 20th century. So I think, and Russia simply does not have the capability economically. It's a poor country. The GDP of Russia is lower than I think it's roughly to that of New Jersey. It's
Right.
a big geography, but doesn't have the economic power. So broadly speaking, I think this idea that we need a big military is part of this corporate deep state ideology, which has sort of influenced our universities and our deep media, but it's not giving us a good reading about how to think about making the world more peaceful.
So what I'd like to respond to this is that my take and my wheelhouse is the whole area of social psychology and
Right.
brainwashing and undue influence. And to me, what's happening in the world is psychological warfare is happening through the internet, through social media, collecting of data on individuals, developing profiles on each person to know which buttons can be pushed to control people's minds for whatever agenda the entity is that buys that data or uses that data with the help of AI. And so for me, I think we need an evolution of consciousness that's based on morality and moral sensitivity and compassion. And as you were saying earlier, Trump is all about blaming others, finding, the enemy, making people afraid of immigrants and the others. And again, realizing that we're on one frail planet. And to me, the fossil fuel corporations and countries that are wanting to insist that we stay addicted to this global warming medium is going to be the demise of all things that live if we don't have checks and balances. And to what you've been saying from the beginning of this interview, I was watching 60 Minutes again this week, and they had people who were in charge of the American National Archives who were saying how important it is that we have these documents of what the actual history is, that people can't just make up stories that, and falsehoods, as Trump is so expert at. So what do you think about my comment about psychological warfare, that maybe China isn't going to have a physical military, but they're working very hard. They've hacked many of our databases with American citizens' private information. That's very concerning to me.
First of all, I'm glad you mentioned climate change because it is the big existential threat along with nuclear war.
Yep.
And again, it's part of this corporate big money kind of influence in the country. There's a lot of money in those oil fields and those, fracking. And so to deal with climate change, we have to deal with these corporate financial powers that play enormous. Actually Exxon is being prosecuted, as you know, right now for lying to the public about what it's doing in terms of there's sort of a greenwashing going on with all these big energy companies. Unfortunately, there's a large movement of people who are involved with that. In terms of the psychological influence, I think it's really important, but I think it's incredibly important to emphasize that a great deal of this psychological influence that's so toxic is not coming from abroad. Yes, the Russians and the Chinese are able to use AI and to be damaging, what's going on in terms of political discourse and financial play in the United States. But my view, and I don't think this differs probably from what you think, Stephen, is that the psychological warfare that's most immediately dangerous to the United States is coming from within. It's coming from Project 25. It's coming from Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society, which gave the 3 Supreme Court justices who just reversed gave the president immunity in the immunity decision, and the Chevron decision, which basically is Project 2025's argument against any kind of regulatory state, against Trump's idea of the deep state. And so while we have to be aware of the way in which Russian influence, for example, affected the 2016 election, the way the current election is being influenced, I'm not saying that's not important. I'm just saying, in my view, by far the most important psychological warfare is going on inside the country. And there's a very I mean, the reason that Trump is so alarming to me is that I think Trump is fully aligned with the huge parts of the far right ecosystem that are pumping out these lies and misconceptions about about black people, about just about immigration. If you look at what happened in Springfield, Ohio, or Aurora, Colorado, where he's simply pumping out these huge lies about people who are actually legal immigrants and are not, they're not eating your cats and dogs. They are fully, the white people in Springfield, Ohio came out en masse to say this is just blatant lie. We're confronted. The danger of Trump, in my view, and I think you capture this in your book, The Cult of Trump, is that we have this incredibly powerful domestic psychological warfare going on, and Trump is pumping out a series of blatantly, this goes back to my argument about proto-fascist forces inside the United States from the very beginning of the country. I mean, the South created a view of a happy, kind of country in which white slaves happily labored because they were being fed for the rest of their life. Ron DeSantis said slaves were happy. The Trump has embraced all of this stuff, and he's running largely on false ideas about immigration and crime and people of color taking over the country. This is a real emergency in terms of cultural and psychological emergency of psychological warfare. So I think my own view, and I think it's sort of bolstered by the history we offer in this book, Who Owns Democracy, that the ecosystem and the culture is owned by these powerful class, big money, big corporate, and caste, white, conservative and religious Christian nationalism, which has been pumping out a tsunami of psychological warfare, lies, dangerous racism. I mean, remember, Hitler learned a lot of his racist ideology from American eugenics and American racial theory, and that's never gone away. When we talk about fascist ghosts perpetuating, since the Civil War, we're not joking around. This is really serious psychological and political warfare being waged inside the country. And the reason we're in such a consequential election is that Trump is now positioned for the first time since the Civil War to fully implement this kind of what we call American fascist history, this legacy in the United States. And it's extremely frightening. And
I totally agree, but I would push back a bit and say that I do believe that we're being unduly influenced by outside forces that are co-opting Americans to believe QAnon and other things. For sure, there are American bad actors. I write about the Koch corporate cult that is pushing free speech, even if they don't allow speech against fossil fuels or against them, but they're for free speech in terms of creating chaos and undoing things. But it's my thesis that when the Soviet Union fell and Putin as a KGB officer was so upset that states were leaving the Soviet Union, that he determined that he would do everything he could to destroy America and make us a bunch of states so that we wouldn't have a strong federal government. And he spent hundreds of millions of dollars. He infiltrated the Christian right, the NRA. He was a big force pushing, assault rifles so that we would have civil war in the streets here, a la Mussolini and Hitler. So I don't put all the focus on internal forces, but for sure they exist for a long time.
Yeah, I think we just differ on the relative importance of, Trump has opened the door wide to Russian influence and to other.
He was recruited as an asset, according to my information, in 1987.
I think that they view him as a useful pawn, but I think Trump is mobilizing an ecosystem that for domestic political reasons. Never underestimate the amount. If you're talking about the Koch brothers, there's a great book called Kochland.
Yes, I interviewed Christopher Leonard.
Okay, that's a great book.
Very important
in
book.
every area of the economy, Stephen, there's a Kochland. They're just, whether you're talking about pharmaceuticals or you're talking about agriculture or whatever, and we trace historically the rise of all these clusters. We talk about the carbon, going back to climate change, the carbon industrial complex, which is like the military industrial complex. So if you can look at, the big military companies that are physically right next door, to Lockheed Martin is the next stop on the subway from the Pentagon. The connection between these companies and the U.S. policy toward the world is just right there.
And overbilling the government for things that should
absolutely
cost a fraction of what they...
And they rotate, the people who sit on the boards of the companies like Raytheon and Lockhart.
Right, the lobbyists.
Yeah, they just... So when they retire at age 50, they go into the top levels of the military, or vice versa. There's a circulation of elites that's part of what we're calling this deep state kind of set of influences. And so there are both foreign and domestic influences, and they're interconnected. But I think we might differ just on, and if people have a chance to read the history, what we try to do in this book is say, look at all the Kochlands as they've developed historically. And they're not just about gas and oil. They're about everything you put in your meal. It's plastics and, it's all
plastics
these things that are collectively.
From oil.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. And it's just sort of so embedded in our economy. And one other psychological thing, the deep state, the corporate world is very invested in social psychology and in culture. You mentioned Ayn Rand. So Ayn Rand wrote the book, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged.
Yep.
And she created a very, very influential book called Selfishness as Virtue. And she's taking the capitalist idea that if everybody focuses on themselves and simply focuses on me, the market will work well. The invisible hand of Adam Smith ensures that when everybody is narcissistically focused on themselves, the collective good will blossom. That's a kind of psychological warfare and cultural warfare. It
was a cult. It was actually a book, A Cult of Ayn Rand.
Yes, and it's now a cult of the whole culture. American Dream. I've written the book you mentioned, The Wilding of America. In this book, I've written multiple books on hyper-individualism and the focus on the self. And because I'm also a social psychologist, and this has come not from foreign influences. It's come from the enormous imperative of companies to convince people that if they buy into the market, and they can then become rich too, and they don't have to worry about other people, because the market, via Adam Smith and the invisible hand, ensures that when you're completely selfish and focused on yourself, the country will benefit and everybody else will benefit. So,
which is BS, as we both know. Which is
obviously BS, yeah. But it's very dangerous. And just like Trump's lies, they have, because of the history of the country, they fall on very resonant ears. And particularly when people, Hitler thrived when there was a Great Depression in Germany. 62% of American workers say they are living paycheck by paycheck. They're not feeling secure. They don't feel their jobs are secure. Those are people who are those are the people who can easily succumb to the idea, well, I'm having trouble. The Democrats aren't giving me a clear solution, but the Republicans are telling me it's the immigrants and the black welfare people who are stealing my jobs, or the criminals, they're rapists, Trump just lies and blatantly calls, and gives people who are hurting a sort of place to blame and the grievance that they can really emotionally resonate to. And that's where the Democrats have got to step in and say, it's not the immigrants that are taking your job. It's not the black people. It's the corporations that are going overseas. It's the way that our economic system is hardwired. Always makes working people feel vulnerable. And we need to, I think Kamala has to be very clear. She started to move in that direction of saying, we want to give a fair opportunity. We want to get the rich to pay their fair taxes. That thread has just got to be highlighted over and over again. If you're going to win this election, but from the blue collar workers in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, who are going to determine who the next president is, So.
Yeah, to me, and I think to you, there's no option that we have to do everything in our power to ensure Trump doesn't get power.
Nothing more important than that right now.
Nothing
Most
more
important election of our lifetime.
So, for me, it's about getting people invested in registering to vote and making sure they come out, especially in the battleground states.
Right.
But also understanding that it's going to take years to undo the harm that we've gotten ourselves into and to create a reasonable approach. And I really believe we need to educate everyone about social psychology and how to discern the difference between a real expert and a faux expert, and real science and faux science, and actual facts and beliefs that are BS.
And I think the history that we try to do in this book, that's why I did this history actually at this point in my life, Stephen, just because I think knowing the story of how all these are not new issues. Everything you just said has been going on for many, many decades. And I just think when you know a little bit more about the story and you've seen how people in the past have responded to it, it gives you some hope despite all its limitations, the democracy that we can use to fight.
That's great. So, Dr. Charles Derber, Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. You wrote this with your co-author, sociologist Yale R. McGrath. Thank you for being, courageous and an activism. Last words, a call to action. Like, if people are listening, aside from reading your book, any other words of wisdom?
Well, I think you nailed it, Stephen. There's no more important thing we could do in the election is 4 weeks away. And people can, the election is going to be determined in a few states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, maybe also Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina. People should put money, call for friends in that area. I tell my students, I talk about the election every class, and we talk about how can young people, which is very, very important, because young people don't tend to, it's all those people who might not vote, who've got to get out, and they've got to realize just how listen, if you don't vote now, you might not have the opportunity again in the future for,
so Trump actually said that.
Yeah. So we have a few weeks. I think Tim Walz said that. He says, I can go without sleep for a few weeks, and then I can sleep. But until this election is over, we should not be sleeping too long. We should be really putting our time into whatever money we have, we can give, phone banking, calling our friends and relatives in the swing states, doing everything we can because this is truly an absolutely existential election. I mean, the future.
And down ballots. We need to stop all the MAGA people from getting elected or reelected.
It's a true fascist threat. And it combines with these existential threats of climate change and nuclear war that it just cannot be emphasized enough. Not to mention all of the psychological and cultural lies and dangers that are sitting right underneath of all this. So we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you again. And I look forward to seeing you again for dinner
I'm going to look forward to our next conversation, Stephen. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Steve Hassan here. It's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the Super Thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.